Okay, so welcome back. This is going to be another live Q&A for 115. Today, in particular, we are going to be discussing the Bottle web server. This is a system that we can use in Python to define our own web server. I'm going to give students a couple minutes just to connect. So I just wanted to sort of go over a few things, just to remind everybody. One, this is a Q&A session. So part of a Q&A session is the Q. Please, if you have questions about the Bottle server, about the coding that I'm doing, any of that sort of stuff, please feel free to ask, type it in. If you have questions about the course more generally or specific issues in the course, those are very valid questions. I don't want to say that you shouldn't ask them, but perhaps it would be better to ask them in Piazza. We have other resources for that. So given that, hopefully you also are staying healthy, staying safe. Remember, it's a lab exam week, so there are some other things going on. What we're going to be doing today, though, is, like I said, talking about the Bottle web server. Just to start off, I have a very simple file here. This is a brand new REPL I created specifically for this. And what we want to do is define a Bottle web server. Now, before we can do anything else in our REPL, and we only have to do this once per space, per REPL, we have to tell Replit to install the Bottle library. And the way that we do that is we click over here on the packages item. It's this little QB-like thing, and it gives us a place to search for it. So we want to type in the name of our server, which is Bottle, the library. So I click on that, and it gives me this little plus sign to add it. And we need to do this because Bottle is not a standard part of Python. Most of the modules that we've been talking about have been standard parts of Python, and so we just need the import statement. For Bottle, we actually need to do an installation as well as everything else. And so this first part, and if you look, there's a bunch of other things that showed up here on this window over here. And what this is doing is, if we go back to our files, you can see that it's created these packager files. It's added some information to the REPL in order to say when we start, we should be using that Bottle library. Now, the first time we hit run, and I'll do that right now, it's going to need to do a little bit more work where it's actually going to install all those files. Went pretty quickly. And you can see that there's a couple things and some things that are a little bit different. First of all, note that here on the right, not only do we have the console like before, here's our console, but we also have this upper section, and this is a web viewer section. Since Bottle is a web server, Replit is going to be helpful and actually display a website for us. And by default, it defaults to a specific route, the sort of default route, which is the one with the name /, so just the home location. And so as you can see, I have it defined. I have my little code here. There's 3 parts to Replit. There's the import Bottle. We need that to use the Bottle library. There is, and this is always at the bottom of the file, the bottle.run statement. This is how we start the Bottle web server. It typically has 2 and a third argument that's useful. The first is host is assigned, and then we want 0.0.0.0. I think I have the right number, 4 zeros. And that tells Bottle that it should accept a connection from any website out there so that anybody who requests a page can get that. If you right now are watching this and want to go to this ridiculously long URL, you could actually get this same page. We need to specify a port, and we're specifying port 8080. Port is assigned 8080. And that's because that's the default port that a web page uses. So that's just telling it to listen to the default web page port. And finally, debug is assigned true. And what that does is that tells the Bottle server to output debug information. So you can see this information over here where it has the IP address. That's the IP address I'm connecting from. That's actually my current IP address, I guess. The time this occurred, and then what request was made. There was a request for the page at location / using HTTP 1.1, and this 200 means it went through successfully. And so you can see the output, I just have a very simple string here to output a page containing hello was hello. Now, if I make a change, suppose I switch this to goodbye, and I reload the page, you can see we got another update here because it made a request. It did update, it did send that request in, but note that the text in the page that in the response did not change. And the reason that text didn't change is that the Bottle web server, it is a web server. It's going to run forever on, in this case, on Replit. It's going to just continuously run. So while I have changed this code, because the program was already running, it couldn't change the version that was actually being executed. So every time we make a change to our Bottle server, to make sure that we actually use that latest code, we need to restart the server using this restart green button right here. And so now if I restart it, you can see that that text changes from hello to goodbye. So that's the very sort of simplistic view just of how we're going to start up with this. Obviously, this isn't a very interesting web server. This isn't what we usually do with web servers. So what I want to do now is switch to a much more interesting version of a web server. So I'm going to get rid of this one. And I'm going to delete it just so that way it doesn't stick around in my account. And I have this now more fancy web server. I have to get it started up. Note that I've already created it and everything else. And when I get it working, what I'm going to do is, as before, I can use the open in a new tab button. Actually, I already sort of done that. And I can see the page that gets sent to my browser. And again, we talked about this a lot last Friday when we were talking about JavaScript and using Java libraries. So now we're going to sort of see the opposite end of this. Remember that all of the rendering of the web page, the visualizing of the web page in any JavaScript runs on my computer or on your computer. It runs in the browser. This is different than all of that Python code in the Bottle server. That runs on the server, in this case, Replit's machines. So one of the facts of this is if I look at the inspector, right? And so what I did was I went into Web Developer and Toggle Tools. It's Command Control I on a Macintosh. It's, I think, Control Shift, Alt Shift I, Control Shift I on Windows. It's been a few days since I've tried to use it. But what we can see from the inspector here is the inspector sees this as a file. From what my computer can tell, everything that it was sent, this whole big thing here, which is not really all that big, is a file that exists on the server. The fact that there isn't actually a file, if we look, I did just from like before, I just returned a string, doesn't matter. Whatever string we return in these functions, that's what's going to be sent to the clients, to the browsers. If it's really a file, great. And if not, not a big deal. So to define one of these functions, what we're going to have to do is start with an annotation. In Bottle, the annotations begin with this @ sign. Then we have bottle.route. That's the name of the annotation. And then the argument for bottle.route is the path, is the resource we want this to respond to. So we're saying here, since this one has a slash, anytime there is a request for that slash folder, that slash file, this is the function to return. Now this function can't take any parameters, doesn't need any, and we need to make sure that we return a string. Whatever string we return, that's what's going to be sent to our browser. I'll actually make this a little bit bigger. I'm also going to make this a little bit bigger because we don't need that anymore. That's what's going to be returned to our browser to be displayed just the same way as we've been doing so far. So you can see here I've got a simple one that just returns a string. We can do more. So here I have a request, and it's going to respond to requests for hertz.html, file name I came up with. And what it's going to use is this function bottle.staticfile. And what bottle.staticfile does is it goes and it's going to read a file from our REPL. So you can see here, I have hertz.html as a file. It just says, what frequency are you? Just a little bit of text. And so what this is going to do is bottle.staticfile is going to read in that entire file as a single string, and then I can return it. So if I try to use this, I get a huge error. So you can see it's causing this internal server error. And the reason why is it's saying static files missing one required positional argument. For the student who's asking about UB Infinite questions, not right, unless your UB Infinite question is about the Bottle web server. This isn't really the best time for that. Please use, we have Piazza and office hours that you can use for asking questions more about just the class in general, or UB Infinite. This really is focused on explaining the coding that you're going to need to do in UB Infinite admittedly later and in the project, but not right away. So the reason that this is giving me an error, and if you look in our debug, you can see it's giving me this huge, big mistake, this big error, traceback stuff. At the bottom here, though, you can see there is a type error, static file missing one required positional argument root. And this is a very common error. This is something that you're probably many of you will have issues with. The reason that this occurred is we need to, in addition to naming the file, we need to specify how we're going to handle this. So in this case, what I'm going to say is, since this Hertz file, hertz.html, is in this main folder, main directory, I need to say root equals, and then a dot in quotes. And now, if I were to reload this page, anyone know if this is going to work? Giving you all a couple seconds. I don't know how long the delay is. It looks like it's a little bit of a delay. So if I try this again, it still doesn't work. And the reason it still doesn't work is I forgot to reset web server. Now I can load it, and you can see it's going to send me and display that page just like we would expect. So note that whether here I have a string I'm sending directly or I read in a file, while on the server that makes a difference, in the browser it looks identical. There's no difference. So That's great if all we ever wanted to do was to respond to all these incoming requests with some basic text, but that's kind of boring. Usually we probably want to do a little bit more. So I have another file here, simple.html. You'll note this might look familiar. This is actually what we talked about on Friday, right? Using that moment.js library. And I've got my JavaScript file here to get that date time element, update it with the current date and time. So now I need to create another route for that, right? That's another file I want to serve. So I have @bottle.route, and I said this will come up at simple.html. And note that I'm going to return it. I'm going to call that bottle.static file, and I'll get simple.html. And this time I was clever. I remembered to add in root equals dot. So now if I run this, and don't mess it up, you can see I get a blank page. I'm not getting what I expected. And the reason why is that first time it kind of worked because it actually was using the cached version of the file, after I fixed it. This second time, I call get simple.html. You can see that over here. And if you look, this response, it says 200. That means I have a function that will handle it. But then it says 0. That means that I responded with 0 bytes. I didn't send anything back. And the reason for this see if anybody knows the reason for this. I'm guessing the answer is no. If you look, this looks pretty good. The thing to remember, this is a very common error that lots of people will make also, is remember we have to return a string. Calling bottle.static file reads in that file as a string, but it doesn't return it. If I want this to work, I need to call return. So I also need to restart it. And so now if I reload the file, you can see it works perfectly well. Once I return that file, it's able to do it. But if we look at the code here, you can see that the code is going to look for a file named mycode.js. If we go back to the REPL, you'll note that the file name is frontend.js, not mycode.js. And yet, it worked perfectly well. And the reason why it worked perfectly well is because, well, frankly, I told it to. If you look, I'm going to get rid of that. I have another function here. Note that it's got an @bottle.route, and it says to respond to requests for mycode.js. Since it's looking for code for mycode.js, whenever there's a request for mycode.js, it's going to come into this function. Now, what this function is going to respond with is it's going to actually read that frontend.js file and send it back to the browser. So again, this is an important thing to remember. All of this Python code is run by the server. All of the code here, the front end, that web page in the JavaScript is run on my computer, a completely different computer. From my computer's perspective, the name of the JavaScript file is mycode.js. Because when it sends a request for mycode.js, it gets it. In fact, if I were to send a if I were to type my code.js here, you can see it will display that. It has no problem. That's what got sent back. If I ask for frontend.js, now this is a file that exists on the server, but it's not going to work. It gives me this 404 error. And the reason it gives me a 404 error is even though that file exists on the server, if I don't define a function, if I don't include a function with an annotation with that as its path, it's not going to work. And actually, let me bring this back for a second. You can see that it didn't work. Make this request one more time just to show you what happens in our debug window. You can see I get this GET request over here. It's for /frontend.js. That doesn't exist anywhere. And you can see that code that I get back, there's 760 bytes, but that code I get back is 404. That is the HTTP code for when we don't have, something isn't found, that page doesn't exist. Even though frontend.js is a real file, since we're not responding to it, it's not going to work. So, any questions about that so far? Okay, there not being any questions so far about this work in the bottle server. I want to show you one last relatively interesting example. So what I did before was I created one last file called name.html. And you'll note this is written up a little odd. This isn't written using pure standard HTML. So in a lot of ways, this looks like an HTML file we've used, right? It's got HTML/HTML. It's got a head section and a body section. But note this, the header 1 says section, and then in double braces has this SEC. And in header 2, it has the professor is, and then double braces name. This is a tool that Bottle uses. This is specific to Bottle. It's called a template. And what it is it's a way for us to write a file once, but have it be able to be used many different ways. And in order to take advantage of this, we're going to need to make another call to our Bottle library. So here I've defined another function. It'll handle requests to secb.html, section b.html. Got a function named here. And what we're going to need to do is call this function bottle.template. That's what we use to read in a template. And so the first argument we have to provide is the name of our template file. In this case, it's name.html. And the second argument we have to provide is a dictionary. In particular, it is the dictionary. It's a dictionary that has a key for each one of those things that we had in the double sets of braces. So if you remember, one of them was SEC and the other one was name. And for each of those keys, we provide a string value. I've got here B and the best. And what that means is if I do a request, for that, note that it says, it comes back with a page and it's replaced that section with B, because that's what we told it to, and name with the best, and it says section B, the professor is the best, which I think we can all agree is true. But so this is one version of it. Note that I have another function here, section A, that also uses name.html. And here I have the dictionary hard-coded in, perfectly acceptable. All of this Bottle code, we're just running Python. We can add anything that we want that's legal in Python. So we can include calls to other functions. In fact, we've done that with the Bottle library. It could be functions we write. We could include loops. We could include selection statements. We could do anything that we want. And in fact, we will be doing this, and for the project, you'll have to do this at times. So here for section A, that's my earlier section, I have the name Hertz. And so what we can do is if I go not to section B, but to section A.html, note that we get the same basic response, but now it says section A, the professor is Hertz. This is a way I can write this page once and change it based on the situation. And these sorts of templates get used everywhere. For example, if you look in UB Infinite, a lot of the pages are basically the same. All of the question pages are basically the same. The only difference is what the text of the question is and how many stars you have, what your username is. There are templates that we're using inside of UB Infinite. UB Infinite is a web server actually written in Python, using a library very similar to Bottle, just it's called Flask. For note that very similar. It's just a little bit fancier, a little bit harder to use also. Most of the ideas carry over. And so we can get these different templates to work. That's something that exists there too. Note that if I typed in, rather than capital S, a lowercase s, it would give me a 404 error. Remember that we are still dealing with a computer. Computers are still nitpicky. They do not like it. You need to match things exactly. If it's expecting a capital letter S, we have to give it a capital letter S. So one last thing that we can do in Bottle is we can actually branch out. We can have a single function handle a number of different cases. So here I've got at bottle.route, and I'm going to say I want it to handle SEC, but now rather than having an A or B or something like that, I've got in greater than or less than the word SEC. And I could make this anything. If I wanted to spell this out, I could. What this is doing is this earlier section, this function. Otherwise, we'll take whatever comes after that, and we're going to make that into a variable, into a parameter for this function named section. And then what I can do is, so now I can handle not just one route, but any series of routes. Now, for 115 right now, we only have two sections of this course, A and B. So we'll allow the section to work, right? We'll say for SEC, we'll just use whatever section they passed in. But of course, that section doesn't really exist. It doesn't have an instructor. So for the instructor's name, we'll just put unknown. And so using this, if I have section A, section B, it works. If I put in section C, note that it replaced that section here, that SEC, with C, because that's what we told it to. And it says the professor is unknown. And we can just use one letter. We could put in something longer. And now we have section I should know, but I do not. And of course, the professor is still unknown. It's still going to match this pattern. So section now, in this case, would be everything that comes after that, which is I should know, but I do not. And so as a result, that's what comes in here for the section and for the name. And so using this, we can now start to do even more powerful things. I can use this with a template. I can use this with lots of other ideas. One thing that we actually use this for in UB Infinite is all of the images, all of the videos, all the graphics are in different sorts of folders. All the requests we have sort of hidden to make it easier for us to manage everything, but also easy to write the code. So it looks as if they're all in one location. In fact, they're not, but we can, by grabbing that, whenever there's a request for that path, happen to make it work. So this is a quick and hopefully somewhat reasonable introduction to the bottle server. We're going to be doing a lot more using the bottle server. In fact, for the project, for part 4 of the project, you'll have to be writing your own server, and we'll be doing other things with this throughout the rest of the semester. Because the whole idea of a web app is we typically have to write 2 parts to it. One part is the HTML, the JavaScript, the front end, the stuff that runs on our browsers, and the other part of it is the server code, the Python code, the bottle code that runs on the backend server on Replit machines. So, given that, any other questions, any questions anybody has about the bottle server? Anything that they want me to go over for today? Okay, doesn't seem like there are any questions. So with that, thank you all very much. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you were able to learn more or understand the bottle server that we're going to be using the rest of this semester better. If you have questions, either on bottle, on UB Infinite, on anything, remember there is Piazza. The TAs have office hours. I have office hours. I had office hours earlier. We're more than happy to help. And there are today's videos on bottle in Panopto, including the attendance question. In Top Hat, there is a Top Hat question today on bottle that you should feel free to, you need to make sure that you answer. Both the attendance and Top Hat are due by 11:59 a.m. on Wednesday. And please stay safe, stay healthy, make sure you practice proper social distancing, and also have some fun. Thank you all very much. I will talk to you all later. Bye.